Fully remote typically actually reduces productivity by 10 to 20%. You can imagine why. There's less connection, less mentoring, less training. But there's two massive advantages. One is you get rid of the office, and that's typically 10 to 20% of costs. And secondly, you can hire nationally and internationally. So say if you're a firm based in London, you can hire in North Wales or in San Francisco, in Mississippi, or any of us can hire in Argentina or Colombia or wherever it is.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and today we're going to talk about working from home and its impact on people, businesses and the economy. And to do that, I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Bloom. He's Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He's been doing an awful lot of work on this subject, certainly since the pandemic and indeed since somewhat before that. Possibly even more importantly from our point of view, he is a former colleague of mine at the IFS who started his career here many years ago, and like many of my former colleagues has gone on to great things, and in his case, great things in California. Nick, working from home is obviously a big topic at the moment. We've had centuries, I suppose, millennia of people going out to work, into the fields, into the factories, into the offices, but something pretty major changed back in 2020 as those of us who could work from home were forced to do so for a period of time, and that will be an interesting historical blip in a sense if it hadn't proved pretty permanent, at least in some sense. So let's start with some sense of scale. What do we know about how many people are now working from home all the time or part of the time, and how that's changed since the pandemic?
So yes, working from home has been a revolutionary change. I think it's maybe the biggest change to UK labour markets probably since World War II. So World War II led to a big increase in female labor force participation, and there's huge changes came on from that. Similarly from work from home. To put some numbers on it, probably, there are two ways to do this. One is the share of full paid days that are work from home. Before the pandemic, that was about 5%. So it's pretty rare. Some people work from home, but not very often. At the peak of the pandemic, that was 60%, which is an incredibly high number. Most people, if they're working from home, mostly they're doing it full time. We've now dropped down to about 25%. If you compare pre versus post, that's a 5-fold increase in work from home, which is just a massive jump up. To put that in perspective in terms of years, working from home was growing pre-pandemic. It was doubling roughly every 15 years from a low base. So what the pandemic has done is basically added about another 40 to 50 years of growth in the space of a couple of years. So if you look at a chart, you can see, work from home is slowly rising. Then there's an enormous jump, and then it's going to continue rising again. And that's the pandemic.
So that was going to be my next question. We've got a lot of working from home at the moment. Since the pandemic, there was clearly a period when people were gradually returning to the office. I can see it I think I can still see it probably on my journey into work. The tubes are getting slightly busier month by month. Still pretty empty on a Friday. Are we still on a downward trend, or are we back on an upward trend?
So we are basically at this point, summer 2023, post-pandemic. We're roughly flat. Everyone kind of gets the idea. I saw there's a piece in the FT today had about how BlackRock's requiring people to be in the office 4 days a week. So yes, there are firms that are currently getting tough and dragging folks in, but also there are companies doing the reverse. I probably talked to 1,000 different organizations and companies since the beginning of the pandemic. Now I'm hearing from us saying things like all our back office stuff, HR, payroll, benefits, some IT support, we've just moved them to fully remote. We've got rid of the offices. We've also worried about a recession, so we're downsizing space. So we are basically now at steady state. The really interesting thing is if you look 3 to 5 years out, it looks like work from home will be higher than it is now. So why is that? Well, that's like Econ 101. So what's called market size effects. So you know that if any market gets big, companies start to innovate to serve that market because there's a lot of money in it. Now, I just mentioned the number of folks working from home has gone up about 5-fold, which means that all of hardware firms, software firms, a load of startups I see in Silicon Valley, companies like Google, Microsoft, etc., they are focused very heavily now on improving software, PCs, equipment, apps to support work from home. And what that means is the technology now is accelerating at a pretty fast pace. So for example, if you think of just Zoom, So go back to, March 2020, there were no emojis, there's no virtual background. Teams, actually, Microsoft's version only had 4 windows. They're now a lot more sophisticated. There are companies I'm talking to that are designing multiple cameras into laptop screens. So whatever part of the screen you look at, you have eye line with the person on the other side. I spoke to a virtual reality company the other day that have like a 3D scan of people. So, that thing in Star Wars where they have, the Jedi Council. Well, the guy was saying, we're hoping to do this in 5-6 years. The prediction is right now we're basically flat. So 23, 24 is going to see some companies holding people back, but others are closing offices. We're flatlined. By the time we're like 27, 28, certainly 2030, work from home levels will be higher than they are now. If you're a CEO or a CHR or someone planning space or thinking to the long run, certainly medium or long run, it's like a Nike swoosh. I tell people it's a Nike swoosh. It's dropping a little bit, and then in the long run, it's going to take off.
It's very reassuring to hear an economist, particularly an academic one, say they've spoken to 1,000 businesses rather than simply blowing the models or analysing anonymous data. From what you get from speaking to those businesses, to what extent is your sense that this is a movement because the workers want to work from home and therefore you need to have this offer in order to make yourself attractive? Or to what extent is actually a view from those organisations that it's cheaper, you don't need to pay for the offices, and actually it can be, if anything, more productive? What extent is this a sort of, let's make ourselves as attractive as possible to workers thing? And to what extent is it actually we've discovered this is a more effective way of working thing?
So really interesting question. So why not I'll give you some facts and then map out an answer. So if you look at the UK, in fact, or the US or Canada or Northern Europe, all of these kind of developed economies, roughly 60% of people come in every day. So they cannot work from home. So they're totally out the equation. Think of retail, manufacturing, security, transport, etc. Of the remaining 40%, 30% are hybrid. So the classic hybrid is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the office, Monday, Friday working at home. The reason for doing hybrid is employees really like it. In our survey data, we see on average that employees value the ability to work from home 2 days a week, about the same as an 8% pay increase. So the research data in hybrid shows the impact on productivity is about 0. You're typically not saving that much office space because everyone's coming in on the same 3 days, but you're keeping your employees a lot happier. So it's all about recruitment and retention. So for hybrid, which probably most of your listeners, most graduates, university graduates, professionals are there, that is very much a play about recruitment, retention, keeping employees happy. The remaining 10% is fully remote. Most of these jobs are now things like payroll, HR, check processing, IT support, call centers. The research data on that shows that fully remote typically actually reduces productivity by 10 to 20%. You can imagine why. There's less connection, less mentoring, less training. But there's 2 massive advantages. One is you get rid of the office, and that's typically 10 to 20% of costs. And secondly, you can hire nationally and internationally. So say if you're a firm based in London, you can hire in North Wales or in San Francisco, in Mississippi, or any of us can hire in Argentina or Colombia or wherever it is. And that fully remote is being very much driven by cost. So when you talk to companies, their view is typically, fully remote employees, they're maybe 10, 20% less productive. We've seen that in various randomized control trials, but they're 50% less expensive. And so that is very much a cost play.
Okay, that's really interesting, and a variation one doesn't often hear about. I mean, the British Chancellor has said that he's worried about working from home because it reduces creativity, and I guess that's part of the reason that you're getting that reduction in productivity from those back office functions. But people also worry about the graduate group that you're talking about. I mean, you've already mentioned, I think, that BlackRock have said they want people in at least 4 days a week. Extraordinary, the sort of British politicians are continually saying they want their civil servants in more, but don't seem to actually be able to achieve that. And instinctively, it feels like that if you're not in the office, if you're not bouncing ideas off colleagues, and this is very important in the IFS kind of context where we're doing research and working on difficult problems and having to be quite creative about what the next issues are and so on, it does feel like there is a cost to people not being in the office together. But I guess what you're saying is if you're looking at those professional sort of roles, as long as you're in 3 days a week, you're getting all of the benefit. Is that a fair description?
Yes, certainly what I would call organized hybrid is where things are heading. So organized hybrid means either team by team or at the company level, everyone comes in on the same day. So the reason this seems to work is cast your mind back to 2019. That seems a long time ago. And think about taking day by day what you did and break those activities up into those that are best done face to face and those that you don't need to be co-located. In the first group, things like meetings, presentations, trainings, some kind of lunches, etc. And in the second group might be email, preparing presentations, doing PowerPoint, etc. It turns out that the typical person spends 50, 60% of their time in the first group. So, the beauty of hybrid is if you can get it right, you say, look, we're going to come in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. These are going to be 3 exhausting days, lots of meetings, presentations, training, lunches. Everyone's in. We're going to get tough. We're going to make sure that people come in. Saying I'm going to work from home because there's a World Cup match or I'm cold that's not acceptable, but you're going to come in for those 3 days. Then the upside is on Monday, Friday, it's more quiet work that's actually better done at home in a quiet environment and you save in the commute. So well-organized hybrid looks like it actually, for example, I have a big randomized control trial where we took 1,600 employees, all graduates, and we randomized them by even and odd birthdays, whether they got to work from home on Wednesday and Friday or they had to come in all 5 days. And the folks working from home on Wednesday to Friday were about 3 to 5% more productive. So about half of them wrote code and we could look at lines of code written in the product shipped. And the reason when you interview them is, look, on Monday, Friday, I don't have to commute. I'm typically spending 70 minutes a day commuting. This is the average numbers. Maybe 30 of that they spend working more. So the employer gets a bit more time. And they say it's quieter at home. But I get my socialization, my meetings, my spillovers on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The chances of common and Elon Musk and Jamie Dimon, all these people beating up on working from home. I think that's true if it's fully remote. In order to make fully remote appealing, and when I talk to execs while they do it, is because it's been accompanied by saving in costs because these people are typically moved abroad. On the other hand, if it's hybrid, I think that's just not true as long as folks are coming in. Normally it's 3 days a week. Paul, I could interview you about the IFS. Certainly for me at Stanford, typically faculty are coming in and teaching is in person. You have to be in person to teach. Research seminars have to be in person meetings, but that's, you typically organize them in 3 days and the other 2, we work quietly at home.
Yeah, and as it happens, the IFS, we've said people have to be in ideally 4 days a week, certainly absolutely 3 days a week. We're a young organization. We're doing lots of creative work and lots of people are getting most of their training here. And that's really important, but it does seem that people appreciate that day.
Totally. It's interesting when you interview people. So there's another myth that people all want to work from home full time. We've interviewed tens of thousands of people in the UK, US, across Europe, actually around the world. And what you normally see is folks want to come into work on average 2.5, 3 days a week. If you look at folks in their 20s, that's even higher. And the reasons are exactly say they want to get mentored. They also tend to be they want to socialize. Often they're single. And these folks don't live in fantastic apartments. So if there's 4 of you in a flat share, no one wants to work from home in their own bedroom. Where are you going to work? So it turns out certainly if you're a company with a lot of 20-somethings, probably 3-4 days a week. If you're a company with maybe a lot of people in their 40s, 50s that are established, you can maybe get away with 2-3 days a week.
I guess it depends on personal preference. I discovered I actually rather like people through through lockdown. I really missed the element of work, which was about talking to people, about doing what I'm doing now, talking to people face to face. So actually, I don't even do a day a week at home because I get lonely. But also, my job is not one of those where I'm sitting, focusing, writing hundreds of lines of code every day in the way that you described. I guess all this has potential big further implications for all sorts of things. One is the property market, where people live, where offices are. But one is, as you said, 60% of jobs you can't do from home. Lots of people like the advantage of being able to work from home. Is that going to change? Is that going to change relative pay? I mean, you said that people like another day or two at home is equivalent to an 8% pay rise. Do you think the labour market will equilibrate in a sense with those jobs that you can't do from home, the pay going up relative to those jobs that you can? Is that going to change the way that the labour market works?
Yeah, so you raised 2 really important big impacts. So I'll start actually with the property market and then I'll come on to pay. So it turns out across British, across American, European cities, we see something called the donut effect, which is like the American donut, which is hollow in the center. So what's happened is hundreds of thousands of people have left city centers and moved out to the suburbs. So we see very clearly In London, if you're in zone 3, 4, 5 out in the suburbs, prices have gone up a lot. Right in the city center, they've been flat. We see in a lot of US cities, they've gone up a bit, but not as much as inflation in city centers. And why is that? Pre-pandemic, if I was working 5 days a week in downtown New York, I basically have to live near there, otherwise I have a massive commute. Now, if I'm only there 2 days a week, I can easily move out to the suburbs. So it's had a huge effect on property markets, and it's reversed almost like 20, 30 years of city center growth. So I remember I was born in the 70s, and when, in the 70s and 80s, there was this idea of living out in the suburbs and driving in and out, and that slowly disappeared. There's some of that coming back. The other thing you raised on labor markets is also really fascinating because it's also reversed decades of history. So since the 1980s, inequality has been rising up until it's peaking in the 2019 in many ways. The gap between earnings if you have a university degree and don't really peaked in 2019. Around about a quarter of that has relapsed in the pandemic, has come back, which is great news in terms of reduced inequality. The numbers I know best, I know the US numbers very well. Is it not the UK? The same thing, its trends have been happening, haven't they?
Well, certainly, we've seen partly because of just very big increases in the minimum wage, the national living wage. What we've really seen is a compression in the bottom half of the distribution. So people right at the bottom have caught up with people in the middle. Certainly a year after the pandemic, people right at the top, there seemed to be a boom in professional services and financial services, which was pulling the top few away from the rest, though that seems to have settled itself down. The really big issue here, which I might want to come on to, is what's happening in the public sector, where lots of graduates working, and if you're looking at hospitals and schools, they're having to go into work, but they're having their pay held back really quite dramatically. And you combine those two things, and you've got, I think, a big problem for the public sector going forward.
So that's interesting. The US dynamic, my accent is British, but living in the US,
there's definitely a twang there, Nick.
I was about to say, in the US, the story is Econ 101. Again, it's what you alluded to earlier. It's basically, if you have a work from home job, it's a lot more pleasant. So if you can work 2-3 days a week from home, it's a nicer job. People have tended to put off retiring a bit. Folks have gone back to work a bit faster after having kids or after being in university. So that's ended up pushing out a bit labor supply of university graduates. If instead you got to go in every day, particularly during the pandemic, that was really pretty unpleasant. You had infection risk. That group's labor supply is actually down versus pre-pandemic. What that's meant is there's been a compression of inequality. So if you look at, say, managers, their pay's gone up 5%. Like Stanford had a pay increase of 4%, but inflation's 8-9%. So in real terms, we're paid about 10% less than we were just before the pandemic. If you look at frontline workers, look at what McDonald's is paying or Chipotle or KFC or anything, those wages have been going up by 10-15% because they're so short of workers. And so we've seen frontline employees have to go in. I've seen real wage increases. So it's, in some ways it feels very perverse, but it's very much economics kind of in action. You've had this incredible perk, which is work from home, which people value about the same as an 8-10% pay increase. So they've wanted to work more, and that's roughly pushed down their wages by about 8-10%. So probably everyone listening, many people are university grads, we've had this great perk. The quid pro quo, in a sense, is our wages have not risen as much as people in frontline jobs.
Interesting question. I don't know whether that's true in the UK. There have certainly been some occupations. Lorry drivers is a very obvious one where wages have gone up a lot associated with all sorts of issues around lack of labour supply. Whether graduates as a whole, for example, have fallen back relative to the median non-graduate over the last 4 years, I don't know. As I say, certainly partly because the national living wage has gone up so much, there's been real compression at the bottom of the labour market. But it also relates to the big problems we've been having here with below inflation pay rises being awarded to, for example, nurses and teachers, who are exactly the people who can't work from home, and exactly from those graduate groups where the outside options, all the people they know, are not only getting pay rises on the whole more than they are, still real pay cuts, but get that work from home bonus as well.
I spoke to someone that was they were formerly an NHS doctor, and they said they'd left their job to take up a job being an administrator in an office, which is normally you'd see as it's like someone's been through years of medical training, and they said they wanted to work from home 3 days a week. And it was an incredible, wow, I don't know how much this is, a generalization, but you could certainly see this, that this is a big perk. If you're in the NHS, you don't get to keep, and at the same time, you're holding down wages.
Yeah, I think government's going to have to respond to that. One part of the property market we've mentioned is this the sort of donut effect. Of course, I bought a house in zone 2, obviously, didn't I, a year ago, but there we go. If you're not in the office 5 days a week, it doesn't matter so much if you're quite how far you are from the office. One of the things that seems surprising, to me at least, is that the sort of commercial property market, as far as I can see, hasn't suffered very much as a result of this. You'd think that if there was only 60% occupancy on lots of these offices, people would need less space and rents in central London will be collapsing. I don't think we're seeing that.
No, so the commercial property market is what's called soft. It's not great, but it hasn't totally collapsed. So why is that? It's a great question. So partly hybrid has typically firms coming in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. As you mentioned, no one wants to come in the office on Friday. So we're like a more extreme version of 2019. If you remember in 2019, no one was working really Saturday, Sunday. No one is really working evenings. So you have offices that are only occupied for 40, 50 hours a week. Now they're just occupied for an even smaller slice, but it's very hard to get away from having no office at all. So a bunch of companies I talk to, to be honest, the corporate real estate folks within those companies are really frustrated. They're getting beaten up by the CEOs who are saying exactly like, we have 50% of our footfall of what we had before the pandemic, but we still have the same footprint. And the answer is it's very hard to have hybrid whereby you have shifts. Now, of course, it's possible. You could say, look, team A is going to come in Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, team B, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, etc. There's some serious problems with that. One is the teams don't overlap. And often the reason companies exist is to spillovers and ideas and cross-fertilization of kind of projects. Second, you've got to have clean desks, which a lot of people don't like. And there's some security. If you leave a folder out with sensitive stuff and some other team sees it. And then C, somebody's got to have Friday and someone's got to have Monday. And so there's a couple of teams that are really peed off that you've hauled them in. So when I talk to execs, and it's not just for-profit companies, I talk to my local city council, some hospitals, school boards, the UN, the World Bank, all kinds of things. They are mostly leaving it up to teams, and teams themselves are mostly picking Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so it's actually really hard to make use of those space savings. And that's saved commercial property. That's not to say in the long run it's not in trouble, because in 3 to 5 years, I can see more rationalization and people work out ways around this, but it hasn't totally collapsed. It's not great. Commercial property is not in a particularly good state, but it's not cataclysmic either.
Really interesting. You've also done quite a lot of work studying sort of effective leadership and management in organizations. I mean, do you see a relationship between the way that well-managed firms have dealt with the move to working from home and other aspects of effective management? Those firms that were being well run have actually moved more smoothly to this and in a way that is more productive. And you've got any sense from talking to all these companies how that works? How have the best ones made the transition and where have things gone wrong, if you can answer that?
No, absolutely. So this is another really big issue when I talk to companies is basically the importance of performance reviews. So just to explain, take it very simply. If you're in the office, imagine, Paul, you are my manager. I'm in the office 5 days a week. By walking by my desk, you can basically see, am I there punching away at the keyboard? When you walk past my computer, is it Excel or is it Champions League? Basically, do I appear to be working? And look, it's not perfect. It's what I would call 5 out of 10 management practices to do management walk around, but it's something. The problem now comes, obviously, if I'm working from home, even 2 days a week, you have no way to see what I'm up to. So it turns out that companies that use what I call input-based management, seeing what people do, struggled quite a bit with when folks went home, particularly fully remote. Companies that used output-based management, think of performance management reviews, 360s, collected data, looked at what you achieved, did much better. You would say, Nick, you can work from home on Monday, Friday, as long as you get your stuff done, your projects reported, your sales targets met, or whatever it is, you're fine. It turns out not only does that work better for managers, it also actually works a lot better for employees. Because if you're my boss, I'm at home on Friday, I'm thinking, I'd like to pick my kid up from school or go to the gym or go shopping or go see the dentist. And if I think like, Paul, you're watching me to see how fast I reply to emails or do I appear to be at my desk all the time? I can't really do that and it's stressful. Whereas instead, if I'm allowed to go to the dentist and work an extra hour in the evening, I may be very happy doing that. And in fact, that's what we see in the data quite clearly. And for example, the randomized control trial, you see work from home employees do about an hour and a half to 2 hours less on the days they're working from home, but they make up for it on evenings, on the weekends. When you interview them, they say it's really valuable, this flexibility. There's a bunch of stuff. Like if you want to play golf, I'm not a golf player, but if you want to play golf, courses are very busy on the weekends. They may be free on Thursday morning. You go do a round of golf, and instead you watch 2 hours less TV in the evening and make up for it.
Yeah, and we've heard exactly that, actually. There have been reports that golf courses are much more busy on weekday afternoons than they used to be. I also want to tell listeners that even before he's working at home, Nick just admitted to a seminar here that when he was at the IFS before, he managed to crash the network by playing a game on it back in the 1990s. So some people didn't have to wait to work from home before they were playing computer games during working hours. And I suppose that's one of the concerns that people have, both managers and I suspect some colleagues, that if you are relying on that sort of input-based focus on what people are doing, there's a worry that some people will at least think or worry that other people aren't pulling their weight. And we know that in an office environment, the one thing that really annoys people is thinking that they're working harder than their colleagues, or that other people are swinging the lead. So do we know if this is resulting in changes in innovation in management practices and in HR practices to move towards more output-based focuses, or other ways of ensuring that the appropriate amount of work is set and produced?
Yeah, so I know there's one fact I know from research, and I'll give you the kind of collection of anecdotes second. But in terms of the actual fact from the research data, what we do know on your initial point is if you look at data collected on management practices, and I and others have collected data on tens of thousands of companies, we see that those that have more rigorous performance evaluation systems had higher levels of work from home adoption, even controlling for industry, size, location, etc., and appeared to have had better performance. So in the data, it's certainly the case that if before you entered the pandemic with a good HR system, you perform better. On whether firms are changing, I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. Interesting enough, early on in the pandemic, when I talked to companies, it was often to like CEOs, because there was such a big issue about work from home. It's a very kind of top line decision. Now I talk much more to CHRs, kind of HR folks, and they are very attuned to this. And actually budgets to HR have been going up for precisely this thing. Because to give you an anecdote, I worked at McKinsey years ago, and the story is for partners, you should be roughly spending a day a week on performance evaluations. And that's an enormous amount of time. That's a lot of money, effectively. But when people are working from home a couple of days a week, that becomes increasingly valuable and important. So companies I talk to, I'm talking to probably 10, 15 a week, different, not all for profit, maybe 2/3 are for profit, 1/3 are public sector and other, NGOs, etc. But they are definitely much more focused on formalized performance evaluation systems. And to be clear, what's important is about output. So it's about what have you achieved rather than about inputs. Inputs was a very early pandemic thing. I don't know if you can cast your mind back to, I'm sure the IFS didn't do this, but April, May 2020, there's a lot of surveillance software being installed, like how many emails, how many keystrokes. That's horrible. That's input evaluation at a distance. Basically, people have moved away from that, but they have moved much more to, we're going to really closely evaluate what you do. And I think it's a win-win for both managers and firms. But if anyone's listening, if you're a company that you have very weak performance evaluation systems, that's one of the first things to fix if you want to have successful work from home.
That's really interesting and really important. And if that's fixed, and your previous work has shown, I think, that companies that do this sort of thing well are companies that do well,
yes,
that they are effective, and maybe therefore being forced into this will improve performance somewhat more broadly. I suppose the last thing I wanted to touch on, if it's something that you can speak about, is whether this changes at all the things that go alongside work. And we've heard that services in the suburbs and further away from cities have more demand, and in central London, certain shops and the places where you go for lunch and so on, the demand is much lower on a Monday and a Friday. Are we going to see a change in the in the structure of cities as a result of this? Are we going to see one thing, and this is purely anecdote, which anyone living in London will know, and I don't know if this is true in other cities, is that London is heaving on a Friday evening, even if no one's been into the office. They're still coming in to go to the pubs and the theatres and the cinemas and so on. Are we going to see them moving more to that sort of role?
Yes. So again, there's a broad discussion exactly on this point that cities are going to shift a little bit away from locations to get work done, a little bit more towards locations for consumption and living. So there is a reduction in space for offices. It's not enormous, as we discussed earlier, but it's definitely there. So one of the drivers of that is in any typical office, about 10% of people have gone fully remote. So those that are hybrid are coming in as they're still in Tuesday to Thursday, so you can't get rid of their desks. But if you think of a typical office, there's HR folks, people doing payroll, a bunch of them have disappeared. And there's less people coming in. Public transit journeys, like for example, the tube and the US public transit is down about 30-40%. This looks like it's permanent. So the future looks more like people are in city centers. They're ideally living there. They're consuming, they're going out to restaurants, bars, theaters. There's a bit less them coming in to treat it as a place to work. Now, it's not a black and white thing, but you're correct that Friday is the first day to work from home. So Friday is going to be very quiet in office land. People are in London on Friday night. I assume most of them have worked in the suburbs, then come in the evenings, which seems odd. But in other ways, London, central London's now just become a location for entertainment. The other thing that's very interesting is the twist in peak loading. So public transport has seen a big surge towards Tuesday, Thursdays, and a drop in Monday, Fridays. I also was speaking to a company called Panera Bread, which is a big US, it's like Pret-a-Manger, and they said they've seen a huge increase in demand in the suburbs and it's dropping down in the city centers. So there's been a kind of twisting. It's not that people have stopped buying sandwiches, lunches, drinks, going out to eat. They just shifted it out to the suburbs and away from the city centers. In the same way that you mentioned earlier, golf playing is throughout the week, people going to gyms, hairdressers, anything that's leisure, shopping centers, anything that's leisure activities has twisted now away from being so peak load on the weekend to being spread in the week. So the pandemic and work from home has changed the structure of the economy. It's not like necessarily a good or a bad thing. The total aggregate demand is there, but it's shifted out to the suburbs and it's shifted throughout the week away from being city center weekend focused.
And remarkable in a way that everything seems to have adapted relatively smoothly. We haven't gone through a period of mass unemployment as people have moved from working in Pret in the centre of London to Pret in the suburbs or whatever the equivalent is. What you're describing is a remarkable change in the structure of the economy in a way that hasn't actually been terribly disruptive in the way that you think of all of the other big changes you can think of the structure of the economy. Or maybe that's partly why we've got such high levels of inflation at the moment. But actually, I'm not sure that it is. I mean, it appears to have been something that we've adapted to, or the economy has adapted to, swiftly and almost seamlessly.
Yes, if you look back, I think if we, 30 years from now, looking back at the pandemic, I suspect there's been millions of people have died, tremendous number of downsides. One of the few positives from it will be the pickup and work from home. And the fact that people have saved hundreds of millions of miles of commuting, same amount of hours, we've reduced pollution, we've improved quality of life. And you're right, it hasn't been that traumatic a change. Interestingly, the reason I think it's stuck is we had the original pandemic. Everyone was thrown home. It turned out to last far longer than we thought. I remember I was teaching a class and I told my class, we're just going to go home. In 3 weeks when the lockdown is over, you're going to, you got it totally wrong. So the lockdown lasted 18 months, 12 to 18 months, or varies by location, but certainly for some time. But then as it was phasing out and people were, re-entering, unemployment rates were very low and the labor market was very strong. And it's switched to, as you discussed earlier, the reason we had work from home is the only way to hire people. I remember talking to a recruiter and she was saying, if you're not offering work from home, just forget it. It's just, you're never going to get anyone. And as that's finally ebbing away, as the labor markets and economy return to some steady state, we basically locked in 3 years of partially or some people fully remote, and it's just here to stay. It's been, an astounding journey, but I think it's a very positive thing. And I get asked a lot why we didn't do this in 2015. We probably could have done this in 2015. Interestingly, we couldn't have done it in 2005 because there was no Zoom, no Teams, no cloud computing, no Dropbox. But certainly in 2015, we had all the video calling, we could file share. We were 5-6 years later than we need to, but at least that change has happened now.
Yeah, remarkable in a way that it took that. I suppose it needed something as huge as a pandemic to create that shift. And as you've set out, there are some potentially quite big but positive changes coming from this in terms of people's lifestyles, but also the potential, at least, for some equalizing of wages in the labour market. I think some people worry that there might also be a disequalizing of experience in the labour market. You talked about the sort of back office staff never coming into the office, and that might, you can imagine, negative long-term effects from that. But before we close, where next with your research on this? You were incredibly fast out of the blocks in terms of doing a whole lot of work. You've obviously spoken to huge numbers of companies. You've produced a lot of the world's first and best analysis of the impact of working from home. And where are you going next?
First, thanks very much. To some extent, I had some pre-pandemic work on work from home, and I was just extremely fortunate. I didn't, like everyone else, no, I don't think really anyone pretty much saw what was happening. The reason I got heavily involved in this is at the outset of the pandemic, I noticed that there wasn't a lot of public data on it. So both in the UK and the US, the government agencies it's hard for them, but they're just not used to rapidly turning and changing the focus. So I started collecting a lot of data. The other striking thing I noticed, it just seems to have taken longer than we thought. I was speaking to an exec in a big financial services firm on Monday, like a very large, famous firm. And she was saying, like, when will this be over? Like, when will we stop talking about hybrid, return to the office? And I was like, I think it's going to ebb out over 2023. But I keep thinking that each year, I think at the end of 2020, I thought, look, people are just going to normalize. So at this point, it's really a process of collecting data. On things like aggregate levels of work from home, it's actually now been flat. It's been about 25%, 30% for the last year. So that's stabilized. We're still seeing churn as company by company. We mentioned some examples. There are companies bringing people back. There are others sending them out. I think it's going to take another few years for this to stabilize. One advice for listeners, by the way, is if your current firm does not offer you what you want, change company. So there's another dimension of job which never used to exist, which is the number of days your employer allow you to work from home. And some of them are saying you've got to come in 5 days a week, and others are letting you come in 2 or 1. If you survey individuals, there's incredible spread. So 30% of people say they want to be fully remote, 20% say they want to be fully in person, and 50% are in the middle. And I think the way this will evolve is like any labor market. Some employers are going to offer fully remote, some are fully in person, some are a mix, and people are going to sort. And that sorting was part of what was the great resignation of a lot of churn. And that will eventually settle down, and people will end up being matched with their employers. And I think we'll end up in a happier place where if I want to be in the office 5 days a week, I'll be in a firm that's promoting that. If I want to be in the office 1 day a week, I'll be in a firm that's promoting that.
I apologise to any employers listening who are about to lose half their staff because of Nick's advice there. But look, we could carry on with this forever, but we are past our allotted time. Nick, that was absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for speaking to me about this. Thanks ever so much for that, Nick. A fascinating conversation. And thank you to everyone for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, visit www.ifs.org.uk. And if you want to find out more about Nick's work, just look up Nick Bloom on the internet. To further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. See you next time.